Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Palestinian diplomacy, how the Palestinians approach and try to resolve a problem diplomatically. It's extremely telling when a person responds to a political challenge with the threat of violence. Even more telling when a society responds to the same challenge with the threat of coordinated, mob-style sanctioned violence. In the Western world, we are taught from a very young age that negotiations and dialogue are tools we use to resolve conflicts, all conflict. And yet, in major parts of the world, the primary choice for solving conflict, both large and small conflict, is through the threat of violence and actual acts of violence itself. This primal response is in many ways pre-modern or pre-Reformation style of problem solving. And it is in the year 2020 the go-to response of both the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. These leaders have embraced violence as a tool through which to obtain their desired goals. They have proclaimed to their citizens of their countries, loudly and clearly, through the old-style conventional media as well as through social media, that violence towards other nations is an acceptable response, that because they have not gotten what they want in the international arena, they will unleash a wave of violence against their perceived enemy. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has issued a call to arms for a new intifada against Israel. The president himself went on tour, drumming up support from Arab and Muslim nations around the world to support the Palestinians and their intifada against Israel and the United States and Western countries around the world. An intifada against the countries that do not give the Palestinians what they want. An intifada in response to President Donald J. Trump's Middle East peace plan, aka the deal of the century, because in his mind, an intifada is the appropriate response for those not willing to accede to his demands. If Abbas has his way, violence will erupt around the world, and like-minded supporters of the Palestinian cause will join them in expressing their anger at the United States and Israel. His hope is that the entire Arab world will erupt in indignation and show their dissatisfaction through riots and jihad. And the Iranian leader followed suit. In place of an intifada, however, the supreme leader has called for a jihad. A jihad is a struggle against the enemies of Islam. An intifada is a Palestinian uprising against Israel, which Abbas is expecting to expand its boundaries to other parts of the world. There have already been several intifadas, and many in the West are quaking in fear. They are waiting for the violence to erupt. But it will not happen. People, even Palestinians, just don't care that much. And very few people actually pay attention to either Abbas or Khamenei. They have called wolf too often. They have overplayed the respective hands. This is not the first time that hyperbolic threats have been made and little to nothing has happened. In response to the unfurling of the Trump plan for peace in the Middle East, Palestinian President Abbas literally told Israel that they will have to live with the consequences of Trump's deal of the century. That statement by Abbas was his way of giving a blessing to Palestinians to start a new intifada. There were fighting words almost immediately after the deal was announced. Abbas departed Ramallah and went to Cairo to meet with the Arab League. From there he traveled through much of the Middle East and then parts of Europe. His trip culminated in an appearance at the United Nations Security Council. Abbas's agenda was to rally friends to support his rejection of the deal. In many ways, Abbas is diplomatically and militarily speaking helpless. The only real tools the Palestinians have are violence and the threat of violence. But calling for an intifada and having one actually emerge are two completely different things. No one disputes that the threat of violence and terror is a serious one. The problem with these threats of violence and the call for intifada is youth. Youth needs to be activated. For an intifada to work, young people need to take to the streets. But at this stage, it is very unlikely that West Bank youth or youth of Gaza will come swarming out to the streets. The reason is simple. They are not very excitable. For youth in the world over, simulated electronic war games are far more intriguing than the real thing and much safer. When analyzing foreign affairs, you can tell much about a situation by looking at who supports and rejects which policies and initiatives. Sometimes, even without knowing all the details, you can get a good sense of the situation based on who is on whose side. Much like the adage our parents often used about how you can tell a person by their friends, that's the case here. The deal of the century is a classic example. It's gotten some very interesting supporters and some very typical detractors. Arab leaders of the Gulf states are supporters of the deal. Iran rejects the deal. The supreme leader of Iran has dedicated several speeches to how the deal is no real deal at all. That's a quote. He said that, quote, Palestine is for the Palestinians, unquote. These are not significant critiques. However, there has been a very significant statement echoed in all of his addresses. The supreme leader of Iran has issued a call for mass resistance. Mass resistance is a euphemism for intifada. That was diplomacy, Palestinian and Iranian style. Now let's look at Israel. Israel is scheduling their third election in 1 year. This is not common. It's not a common occurrence in developed democracies at all. But Israel is not a banana republic. It is a strong democracy, and Israel is still in the laboratory stages of development. Think about it. The United States is going through crazy political gyrations, and no one is questioning its democratic foundations. There are many who draw parallels between the leadership of Israel and the United States, between Netanyahu and Trump. There are some similarities, but there are differences, and the differences are tremendous. Most critics are latching on to the fact that Trump and Netanyahu were hit with public hearings, impeachment in the United States, and a trial and indictment in Israel. True to their modus operandi, in this instance also, the Palestinians came up with a strange and unusual take and reaction. Ahmed Tibi, a doctor, medical doctor, Arab member of Knesset, major advisor to the Palestinian Authority, said that his constituency will come out to vote in force this next election in order to oust Netanyahu. He said, and I'm quoting here, the joint list will be strengthened and will gain more seats in the upcoming election, unquote. Tibi then added his opinion offering that Trump and Netanyahu will be removed from office and that when that happens, the world will be better. He said, and I'm quoting again, 2020 will be the year of impeachment of two people without whom the world will be better, Trump and Netanyahu. We will replace Netanyahu with the election where some Arab voters will cast more votes than the last election. Good analysis needs to be done outside of personal emotion. Otherwise, emotion gets in the way. In this case, it is unwise to consider these politicians knocked out. They are too resourceful, too resilient, too dynamic. Of course, only time will tell for sure. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. I want to share two columns today, one from the New York Post and one from the New York Times. First up is a column from the Post. It's written by Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. The piece was published online on February 9th, 2020, and in print on February 10th, 2020. This column was written as a preemptive strike ahead of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's presentation to the United Nations Security Council and their resolution against the Trump plan of the century. The column is called Mahmoud Abbas Makes Noise at UN Again, rather than try to negotiate peace. Sometimes authors of op-eds use humor to try to be tongue-in-cheek. That's how Danny Danon begins. I don't find it particularly funny or poignant in any way, but that's how they make their point, and Danny Danon makes it this way. Someone in the Palestinian Authority should get President Mahmoud Abbas a map, because he seems to be lost and confused. You'd think he'd respond to President Trump's peace to prosperity plan by traveling to Jerusalem or Washington to negotiate directly with Israel. Instead, he's coming to the Big Apple. On Tuesday, he will speak before the United Nations Security Council and seek a vote condemning the American plan. This isn't the first time Abbas has taken a very wrong turn. Danon now explains the history of Palestinian rejection. It's a consistent reaction, repeated over and over for decades. He writes, after receiving an Israeli peace offer in 2008, he continued down the well-trodden path of Palestinian rejectionism and never delivered a response. 4 years later, Abbas evidently lost his way to the Obama White House, refusing to respond to Israeli gestures and explore ways to break an impasse in negotiations. Instead, he ended up petitioning the United Nations General Assembly to grant the PA non-state observer status. 2 years ago, the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, in recognition of historical fact, present-day political reality, and U.S. law. Abbas again ran to Turtle Bay to denounce the administration's decision instead of negotiating. Now Danon explains that Abbas's strategy of trying to gain support from the international community will not succeed. And he writes that Abbas will not stop until the deal is destroyed. The op-ed continues. As in the past, Abbas is combining his pleas for international sympathy with incitement back home. To generate attention for his dramatics at Turtle Bay, he is inciting violence and calling for a habitual Palestinian day of rage. This time, he said, he would thwart Trump's plan no matter who the victims might be. As usual, it is Israelis and Palestinians who will pay the price of such incendiary rhetoric. Now Danon explains why Abbas consistently goes to the UN instead of the interested and concerned parties like the United States or Israel. Danon writes, perhaps the reason Abbas so often tucks tail and runs to New York is that the Palestinians can find a semblance of support only at antiquated international organizations, like a mother shielding a child fearful of facing reality. The Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the United Nations, and other such institutions still try to shield the Palestinians in their agenda, and they still speak with a fairly unified anti-Israel voice. Danon concludes by explaining that the Palestinians must say yes, that 73 years ago, Israeli leaders said yes. And this is how he concludes. 73 years ago, Jewish leaders said yes and never looked back. In the same time, Palestinian leaders have repeatedly said no and never stopped looking back. With his scheduled trips to New York, Abbas is committing the Palestinian people to living in the past. His repeated rejections through this decade and a half in office have held his people back from a prosperous future. As Trump, like his predecessors, explained last week, the path towards a brighter future begins with negotiations in Jerusalem. Someone with the best interests of the Palestinian people in mind would do well to remind Abbas of this fact and point him in the right direction. This column is incisive, well thought out, very good advice, well written. Too bad it will fall on deaf Palestinian ears. Second up is a column from the New York Times. It's written by Thomas Friedman. Friedman is the best op-ed writer, and I find that his insight into the Middle East is always worthwhile, even when I disagree. Friedman was the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem for a good period of time, and before that, he was their stringer in Beirut. The title of the column is Trump Bibi's Chump? It was published on January 29, 2020 online, and January 30th, 2020 in print. The title was first used actually back in 2016. The New York Times recycled it because they liked it. The column is an attack on both leaders, on Trump and Netanyahu. This is how Friedman begins. Given the timing of the release Tuesday of President Donald Trump's Middle East plan, I have to begin by asking, is this plan about two states for two peoples, or is it about one diversion for two dirty leaders? It sure feels like the latter. After all, both Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are, in effect, facing job-threatening charges. Trump for obstruction of justice and abuse of power, and Bibi, who was literally indicted Tuesday for fraud, bribery, and breach of trust. They both have a huge need to change the subject and shore up their common base of right-wing Jews and evangelicals. Friedman now explains that he would never have released the plan now. He writes, if I were Jared Kushner and had worked for 3 years on the peace plan and was serious about getting a fair and full hearing from all sides, there is no way I would have released it right now. This smells. But then, my long-held view has always been that the Middle East puts a smile on your face only if change for the better starts with them. Camp David started with the Israelis and the Egyptians, and America was brought in only later. Oslo started by the Israelis and the Palestinians, and America joined only later. Tunisia, the only Arab Spring country to make its way to democracy, is the one Arab country that America had virtually nothing to do with. For a peace initiative to be serious and sustainable, it should always start with them. Friedman spends the rest of the column berating both leaders and their decisions. Before he concludes, however, Friedman does tell the Palestinians that they should be making lemonade. He understands that they're upset, but knows that they should have said yes. Friedman concludes by writing, but bottom line, without Trump getting Netanyahu to definitely end his claims to all the West Bank, and without Palestinian leaders able to reunite their disparate political factions in Gaza and the West Bank into a single body that can theoretically say yes to a fair outcome for their people, while also recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, Trump's deal of the century will join a century-old library of failed Middle East peace plans. Thomas Friedman is an excellent stylist, but like many of his colleagues in the New York Times, he despises both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to discuss 3 cartoons today and a 14-second short. The first cartoon comes from Portugal. This cartoon is an abuse of the Holocaust and extremely anti-Semitic. Bibi is pushing a coffin draped with a Palestinian flag into a crematorium, into an oven. On the oven is the German expression Arbeit macht frei, the expression from Auschwitz that means work will set you free. The cartoon was drawn by Vasco Gargalo and was published on January 29, 2020. This cartoon is totally offensive. After it was published, Israel's foreign ministry actually called the Portuguese deputy ambassador for an explanation. They called him in. Why the deputy ambassador? Because the ambassador was away and it was urgent. The next 3 items are about coronavirus. This is a virus of biblical proportions. It needs to be confronted on an international scale, and China is not doing what it needs to do. It's not doing what needs to be done. In the first of these cartoons, 2 Muslim women are walking totally covered in their burqas. They're also wearing surgical masks. One says to the other in Hebrew, actually, because it's a Hebrew cartoon, Zeh ma shehaya chaser lanu. Freely translated, that means, this is just what we needed. The exact translation actually is, this is what we're missing. While the cartoon is funny, it is also very telling. Obviously, those who cover themselves would never ever consider making a comment like this. But the rest of us are thinking it as they're walking around with surgical masks. The title of the next cartoon is Fear of the Coronavirus. It was drawn by Patrick Chapate and was published in Germany in Der Spiegel. There has been a shortage of surgical masks around the world, you should know. And this cartoon makes fun of that. We see a pharmacy and a sign that reads, "We have surgical masks" in German. The man buys a mask, puts it on, and reads the package which says, "Made in China." He's obviously not happy with that. Finally, a short by Larry David. Let's play the short. It is absolutely hilarious. It is so true. Yes, people need to be aware of their hygiene. Yes, they can wear masks, but despite all the precautions, they could still be exposed. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. An Al Jazeera host, Faisal El-Qassam, host of a program called The Opposite Direction, tweeted that Israel is the most successful project of the past 2 centuries. This is what he wrote. He wrote it in Arabic, by the way. For most Arabs, if they want to curse you, they will describe you as a Zionist, even though they know that the most successful project in the current and last century is the Zionist project. There was, as expected, blowback on Twitter. So Qassam decided to ask his 5.5 million followers what they thought. 6,000 responses, about just over 6,000 responses, came in, and well over 80%, 82% of them agreed that Israel was modern, more democratic, more technological than any of the Arab countries. He asked those questions. Qassam also hosted the IDF Arabic spokesman several times on his show via Skype. And of course, there were people who condemned that too. Qassem's response was that people just do not understand history. He said that in Arabic, calling a Zionist is considered a curse, while it should be considered a compliment, because Israel has achieved what every Arab state merely promised. After 4 attempts in a row, Iran again has failed yet to successfully launch their satellite into orbit. The Zafar, which means victory in Farsi, was launched, but the rocket on which it piggybacked did not reach a fast enough speed and an altitude high enough necessary to keep the satellite in orbit. Iran has been launching satellites into space since 2009. Many of them have been successful, but most of them have been spy and communication satellites. The Iranians would use and contract the Russians and use their rockets to get them into space. Now they're trying to do it on their own. Recently, however, the Iranians have wanted to do it on their own, and in that way, they are failing. This actually requires more than simply knowledge. It requires better technology. Most of the hardware must be imported, and given the sanctions and restrictions placed on Iran, this is not an easy task. Almost every element connected to a successful satellite launch can and will be utilized in ballistic, conventional and non-conventional strikes. That's knowledge that is important for us to have. The Palestinian Authority has issued a ban on importing fruits and vegetables, carbonated drinks, mineral water, and juices from Israel. This is a very bad idea. The Palestinians, the authority, is actually responding to a decision by the Israeli Defense Minister, Naftali Bennett, to boycott certain PA produce. But Bennett was responding to the PA boycotting livestock from Israel. It's a vicious cycle of boycotts. And the problem for Palestinians is that Palestinians need Israel much more than Israel needs the Palestinians. The PA economy is dependent on Israel. Just to get a sense, Israel imports 55 million in fruits and vegetables per year from the Palestinians. The Palestinians import 300 million from Israel, just in fruits and vegetables. The Palestinians could never produce and provide that amount. Besides, that is not what and how an economy should work. Buy what you can't produce. That's the principle. Don't waste your money on things that can be made much better and more cheaply elsewhere. Palestinians purchase over $100 million in bottled water from Israel alone. This is a very bad decision on their part. A new study from Israel's Census Bureau has posted a remarkable 3.3 million people in Israel are immigrants. That's a remarkable number. Given the total number of Israel itself, the population is just over 9 million, and that the Jewish population is just over 7 million. From the years 1990 to the present, 43.7% of Israel's immigrants made their way to Israel. That's unbelievable. In real numbers, that means that nearly half the Jewish population and 1/3 of the population the total population came to Israel from elsewhere. Well, there's a remarkable set of statistics. Israel always saw herself as a refuge for Jews in trouble. Over the years, the Jewish state has also become a magnet, not just a refuge, a magnet, a place where Jews do not run to, but rather come to because they want to come, to replace their homes in the diaspora. It is the diaspora that is a temporary home. Israel is their permanent home. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Earlier, we discussed the coronavirus, and I said that it truly is a plague of biblical proportions. The Tanakh, or the Jewish Bible, has several types of plagues. The 10 plagues that God brought down on Egypt and Pharaoh are one set. But another plague was when the Assyrian king Sennacherib, or Sennacherib, as he said in English, besieged the city of Jerusalem in 703 before the Common Era, BCE. This is described in 2 Kings, in Chronicles, and by the prophet Isaiah. The city was suffering badly from the siege, totally surrounded by the Assyrian army. No food, no hope. One morning, the city awakened and discovered the army was gone. It was a miracle. Isaiah explains that 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died of a plague. The city of Jerusalem was saved. Plagues have wreaked havoc not just in the Bible, but also in the Middle Ages. Remember in the 1340s and 50s, the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, killed 1/3 to 2/3 of Europe. That number came to somewhere between 75 to 200 million people. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.